The stagecoach was already gone. Nora Voss stood in the middle of a dirt road that smelled of dry heat and horse dust, watching the last curl of red earth settle back down where the wheels had been. The sound of hooves had faded into nothing. The desert silence rushed in to fill the space, vast and indifferent and complete. She did not move for a long moment. She simply stood there, her carpet bag hanging from one hand and a crumpled piece of paper clutched in the other, and she looked at the wooden sign nailed to the post at the edge of town, Harrow's Crossing. She looked down at the paper, then back up at the sign. The town written on her travel documents was not Harrow's Crossing. It was not even close. This was the kind of mistake that happened to other people, to women who were careless, who did not pay attention, who let themselves be swept along by circumstance without thinking clearly. Nora Voss had spent the better part of 22 years making absolutely certain she was not one of those women. She had planned this journey down to the last detail, had saved every coin with a discipline that bordered on punishment, had written and rewritten her correspondence until each letter was exactly right. She had done everything correctly. And she had still ended up here, in a town she had never heard of, with a trunk too heavy to carry, and no way to continue north until Thursday. 3 days. She pressed her lips together and did not cry. She had not cried when her parents died of a fever outbreak when she was 12 years old, leaving her in the care of an aunt who viewed orphaned nieces primarily as a source of unpaid labor. She had not cried through 10 years of cooking and cleaning and mending in a household where her name was rarely spoken and her presence was taken entirely for granted. She had not cried when the one man she had allowed herself to trust had simply disappeared one morning without a word, taking with him whatever small, careful hope she had been foolish enough to build around him. She was not going to cry now, standing in the middle of a dirt road in a town that was not her destination. What she did instead was open her small notebook. It was a battered thing, the leather cover worn soft at the corners, the pages dense with her neat, precise handwriting. She had carried it for years. It had started as a way to keep track of her aunt's household accounts, which no one else bothered to verify and which, as it turned out, needed verifying desperately. But over time, it had become something else. A record of everything she observed, and everything she noticed, and everything she filed away for later, because she had learned early that information was the only currency she reliably had access to. She opened it to a fresh page and wrote the name of the town, the direction she had come from, and a brief note about the fact that the next northbound coach would not pass through until Thursday morning. Then she closed the notebook, put it back in her bag, and looked around. Harrow's Crossing was not much to look at. The main street was perhaps 200 yards of packed earth lined with weathered wooden buildings that had clearly been built in a hurry and maintained with only slightly more attention than that. There was a general store with barrels stacked outside, a farrier's shop where she could hear the rhythmic clang of metal on metal, a small building with a painted sign advertising rooms by the week, and a church at the far end of the street, whose steeple leaned slightly to the left, as though the weight of its own ambition had grown too much to bear. Mountains rose in the distance behind all of it, their slopes the color of rust and sage, their peaks cutting a jagged line against a sky so blue it almost hurt to look at. The heat was extraordinary, nothing like the summers she had known back east, where the air at least had the decency to carry some moisture. This heat was dry and absolute. the kind that crept under your clothes and settled into your bones and made the simple act of breathing feel like something you had to think about. Several people moved along the wooden sidewalks on either side of the road. She could feel their curiosity without looking directly at them. A woman standing alone in the middle of the street with a heavy trunk at her feet was not a common sight, and Harrow's Crossing was clearly the kind of place where uncommon sights were noted and discussed. She was considering her very limited options: the boarding house, the shade of the general store's overhang, the remote possibility that she could find someone willing to drive her north for whatever she could pay. When she heard footsteps on the wooden boards behind her, she turned. The man coming toward her was tall, well over 6 feet, with the kind of lean, deliberate build that comes not from any particular intention, but simply from years of physical work repeated every day without complaint. He was carrying a large sack of grain on one shoulder, as though it weighed nothing, and his dark hair, threaded through with early silver at the temples, curled slightly at the collar of a worn work shirt. His face was angular and sun-darkened, the jaw shadowed with several days' worth of stubble, and there was a thin, faded scar along his left cheekbone that pulled slightly when he moved. But it was his eyes that stopped her. They were gray-blue, the color of storm clouds reflected in still water, and they assessed the situation in a single, unhurried glance. The trunk, the bag, the direction the stagecoach had gone, the piece of paper in her hand, her face. He set the sack of grain down beside the wall of the general store without apparent effort. "Next coach north doesn't come through until Thursday," he said. His voice was low and measured, with the slight, unhurried cadence of someone who had spent considerable time in open spaces where there was no reason to rush anything. "I know," Nora said. She watched him take in the full situation. She had the feeling he was very good at taking in situations, the kind of person who noticed things without making a performance of noticing them. There was something in the economy of his attention that reminded her, faintly, of the way she used her notebook. The same quiet cataloging, the same preference for understanding before speaking. "Calamadair," he said. Not quite an introduction, more like an offering of information he thought she might find useful. "Nora Voss." She straightened her spine slightly. "I was meant to continue on to Teller Creek. I seem to have misheard the driver." He looked at her for a moment without saying anything. There was no pity in his expression, which she appreciated. There was no dismissal either. He was simply looking at her the way a person looks at a problem they are genuinely considering how to solve. "I have a ranch 2 miles out," he said. "My housekeeper and her husband live on the property. You could stay there until Thursday. It would be more suitable than the boarding house." He paused. "It's not an imposition. Edith has been asking for company." Nora looked at him carefully. She had learned, over the course of her life, to be a very good judge of what people wanted when they made offers. Her aunt had wanted labor disguised as charity. The man she had trusted had wanted something she still did not have a precise word for. She had become skilled at reading the shape of a person's intentions beneath the surface of what they said. This man wanted nothing from her. She was almost certain of it, and the certainty was so unexpected that it took her a moment to trust it. Every sensible principle she had ever developed told her to refuse. She did not know him. She was a woman alone in an unfamiliar town, and the appropriate response to a stranger's offer was a polite decline, followed by an independent solution, regardless of how limited those solutions were. She had managed difficult situations before on far fewer resources, but the sun was genuinely brutal, and the boarding house had the look of a place where the sheets were rarely changed, and she had 3 days to fill somehow, and something in the stillness of his offer, its lack of performance, its plainness, made her think that it was exactly what it appeared to be. She made a decision. "That's very kind of you," she said. "I would be grateful." Something shifted slightly in his expression. She might have called it relief if she had thought he was the kind of man who felt relief. He bent down and lifted her trunk onto his shoulder in one smooth motion, as though it were empty. "Wagons around the side," he said, and walked. She followed. They drove out of Harrow's Crossing in a silence that was not uncomfortable, exactly, but had a kind of weight to it. The weight of two people who were each accustomed to silence and were therefore not quite certain what to do with the fact of another person sitting next to them. The landscape opened up as the town fell behind them, the road cutting through low hills covered in pale grass and twisted desert shrubs she did not know the names of. The mountains ahead seemed to grow rather than approach, gaining detail slowly. The dark lines of ravines, the pale patches of exposed rock, the occasional dark smudge of something that might have been a stand of trees at higher elevation. She was aware of him beside her, the way you become aware of weather, not intrusively, just as a fact of the environment. "You've lived here long?" she asked, more to acknowledge the silence than to break it. "5 years, he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "Came west before that. Worked cattle drives for a time. When I had enough saved, I bought the land." "Is it a large operation?" "Not by most measures." A pause. 200 head. Some horses I train for sale. It's enough. There was something in the way he said it, that quiet, undefensive certainty, that she found unexpectedly moving. She had known a great many people who spoke about what they had with either inflation or apology. She had almost never heard anyone describe their life as simply enough without making it sound like a concession. She looked out at the passing landscape and thought about her own life, which she had for years described to herself in terms of what it lacked, the freedom she did not have, the choices that were not available to her, the future that remained stubbornly vague and contingent on factors outside her control. She had signed the correspondence agreement with Edmund Farr, a reasonable man in Teller Creek who ran a dry goods business and needed a capable wife, because it was the most concrete option she had found, and Nora Voss was a person who preferred concrete options to vague ones. She had not thought about it as a love story. She had thought about it as a door. They crested a low rise and the ranch came into view. It was modest. She had expected that. But it was not modest in the way of places that had given up. It was modest in the way of places that were doing exactly what they were meant to do. The main house was built of adobe and timber, its walls thick enough to keep out the heat, its covered porch running the full length of the front. A barn stood off to one side, well maintained, the doors hanging straight and true. A corral held several horses who moved with the idle ease of animals that were well fed and not frightened. 2 smaller structures sat at a short distance from the main house, one of which showed the signs of habitation. A small kitchen garden to one side, curtains in the windows, a rocking chair on the narrow porch. A woman came around the corner of the main house as the wagon approached, shading her eyes against the glare. She was perhaps 50, solidly built, with the deeply weathered complexion and capable hands of someone who had spent decades working outdoors. Her silver-streaked hair was pinned back in a practical knot, and she moved with the unhurried authority of a person who knew exactly where everything on this property was and why it was there. This, Nora understood immediately, was a woman who noticed things. Callum pulled the horses to a stop and climbed down. "Edith," he said, "this is Nora Voss. She had trouble with the stage. She'll stay in the spare room until Thursday, if that works." Edith Pratt looked at Nora with clear, frank eyes. The look was not unkind. It was simply honest. The assessment of a practical woman who had seen enough of the world to know that people were usually neither as good nor as bad as they first appeared, and that the truth generally came out in the small details if you paid attention. Then she smiled. It transformed her face entirely. "Of course it works," she said. "Come down from there before you get heat stroke." She took Nora's arm with a matter-of-fact warmth that allowed for no argument, and Nora found herself being guided toward the smaller of the two outbuildings, while Callum followed behind with the trunk. Roy Pratt, a lean, quiet man with sun-squinted eyes and the unhurried movements of someone at complete peace with physical labor, appeared from the direction of the barn, nodded once at Nora with the assessment of a person who would form his own opinion in his own time, and went to help Callum with the wagon. The room Edith showed her was small. A narrow bed covered with a quilt in shades of ochre and deep blue, a wooden chest at its foot, a single window looking west toward the mountains. There was a braided rug on the floor, and a small table with a basin and pitcher, and the whole space had the feeling of having been cared for without being fussed over. "It's not much," Edith said. "It's perfect," Nora said, and she meant it. She had shared a crowded attic room for most of her adult life, her privacy bounded by thin walls and other people's noise and the constant awareness of obligation. This small, quiet room felt like something she had not known she was missing. Callum appeared in the doorway with her trunk, set it carefully at the foot of the bed, and straightened. The room was not large, and he was. There was a brief, particular awareness of the confined space, the presence of him filling it in a way that was not threatening, exactly, but was very much there. She noticed the scar on his cheekbone again in the different light. She noticed the way he did not quite look at her directly, his gaze landing somewhere just past her shoulder. "If you need anything," he said, "the main house is just there." He touched the brim of his hat and left. Nora stood in the small room for a moment after he was gone. Through the window she could see the mountains turning gold at their peaks as the sun began to lower. She could hear, faintly, the sounds of the ranch settling into its late afternoon rhythm. Horses moving in the corral, Roy's voice somewhere at a distance, the soft, domestic sounds of Edith in the adjacent room. She set her bag down and unpacked only what she needed. While she worked, she let herself look slowly around the space she had been given. It was only then that she noticed, through the open doorway into the small sitting area of the cabin, something on the shelf above the stone fireplace. Not in her room. In the common area Edith apparently used for sitting in the evenings. A pair of leather work gloves. A woman's gloves, sized for smaller hands than Edith's, folded with a care that had nothing to do with storage and everything to do with preservation. The leather was good quality once, now dried and faded and clearly long unused, kept not because they were useful, but because getting rid of them was simply not something anyone had been prepared to do. Nora looked at them for a moment. Then she looked away. She did not ask. That evening, Edith came to tell her that supper was served in the main house. This surprised Nora. She had assumed she would eat separately, that the terms of her stay would involve a polite and practical distance maintained by all parties. But Edith simply said, "We all eat together," in the tone of someone stating an obvious fact, and Nora followed her across the short distance of yard to the main house without further comment. The inside of Callum Adair's house was not what she had expected, though she would have struggled to explain precisely what she had expected instead. The main room was large and sparsely furnished, with a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall and a table long enough to seat 8. But the wall opposite the fireplace was lined with bookshelves, and the books on them were not decorative. They were red. Their spines were broken and their pages were swollen with use, and they ranged from practical volumes on land management and animal husbandry to novels she recognized and several she did not, to what appeared to be a complete collection of someone's poetry, the cover worn nearly to bare board. She became aware that she was staring. "You're welcome to borrow any of them," Callum said from behind her. She turned. He had come in from the back of the house without her hearing him and was standing near the fireplace, watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "I don't get much time for reading these days, but I like having them there." "Dickens," she said. "And is that Whitman?" "And a few others." She looked back at the shelves. There was something in the combination, the intensely practical ranching manuals alongside the poetry, the navigation guides alongside the novels, that told her something specific about the shape of his mind. She added it to the picture she was already building without quite realizing she was building one. Supper was beef stew and fresh bread and roasted root vegetables from Edith's garden, and it was some of the best food Nora had eaten in years. She said so, and Edith accepted the compliment with the straightforward pleasure of someone who took genuine pride in their work. The conversation around the table was easy in a way that surprised her. Roy told a story about a horse that had refused to be shod for 3 consecutive farriers until Roy had simply sat down in the stall and waited for half a day, at which point the horse had apparently walked over to him and put its head on his shoulder. Edith asked Nora about her journey, listening with real attention to the answer. Callum was quiet for the most part, but he was not absent. He listened and occasionally said something brief that was either genuinely funny or surprisingly precise, and the others responded to it as though this was simply the ordinary register of the man. There was no hierarchy at this table, no careful social performance, no silence born of tension or grievance. It was simply 4 people eating a meal together at the end of a working day, and the ease of it made something in Nora's chest ache with a feeling she could not name precisely. She thought of every meal she had eaten in her aunt's dining room, where the quality of the silence had been its own form of instruction, where nothing she said was quite right, and nothing she did was quite enough, and the best outcome of any given evening was simply to pass through it without attracting notice. She had not known that meals could feel like this. After supper, Callum walked her back to the cabin across the strip of yard between the main house and the smaller building. The sky had gone deep blue-black, scattered with more stars than she had ever seen. The city sky she had grown up under was a pale imitation of this, washed out and partial, a suggestion of stars rather than the thing itself. Out here, there was nothing between her and the full weight of the night sky, and it was, unexpectedly, a little overwhelming. They walked slowly. Neither of them seemed in particular hurry to arrive. "May I ask you something?" she said. He made a sound that she took for assent. "Why did you offer to help me? You didn't know me. You had no obligation." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. The night sounds of the desert moved around them. Insects, a distant bird, the soft movement of horses in the corral. "You reminded me of someone," he said finally. His voice had a different quality in the dark, lower, more careful. "Someone who used to stand exactly like that. Straight spine, no complaints, trying very hard not to let anything show." She waited. He didn't say who. They had reached the cabin door. He stopped and turned to face her, and in the dim starlight, his gray-blue eyes were very dark. "Good night, Miss Voss," he said. "Good night, Mr. Adair." He turned and walked back toward the main house. She watched him go. The unhurried certainty of his stride, the way the starlight caught briefly on the silver at his temples. And then she stepped inside. She lay in the narrow bed for a long time, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert night and looking at the ceiling in the darkness. Through the wall, she could hear, faintly, the low sound of Edith and Roy's voices. Too quiet to make out words, just the comfortable rhythm of two people in easy conversation before sleep. The leather gloves were still on the shelf in the common room, invisible in the dark, but somehow present. She thought about the question she had asked and the answer he had given, and the name he had not said. She thought about Thursday, which was 3 days away, and about Teller Creek, which was 40 miles north, and about Edmund Fair, who was a reasonable man with a practical proposal and a life she had decided to accept. She thought about how it had felt to sit at a table where no one required her to be smaller than she was. She told herself firmly that she was tired, and that things always looked different after sleep, and that in the morning she would feel the way she had felt before, clear and practical and certain about the shape of the life she was building. But the stars were still out there beyond the window, enormous and indifferent and more beautiful than she knew what to do with. And sleep was a long time coming. The second morning came in quietly, the way mornings do in open country, not with any particular announcement, just a slow brightening at the edge of the sky that turned the mountains from black shapes into something with color and dimension. And then the sun itself came over the eastern ridge, and the whole landscape ignited at once, gold and rust and the particular pale green of desert grass, catching light it had been waiting for all night. Nora was already awake. She had been awake for some time, in fact, lying in the narrow bed and listening to the ranch come alive around her. The horses first, a soft restlessness in the corral, the occasional sound of hooves on packed earth, then Roy's boots on the path outside, unhurried and deliberate. Then the smell of wood smoke from Edith's stove drifting through the window she had left open against the heat. She dressed in the gray cotton dress she had packed for practical purposes rather than impressions, pinned her hair back with the efficiency of someone who had never had much patience for the ceremony of it, and went to find something useful to do. Edith was at the stove when Nora came into the small kitchen of the cabin, and the look she gave was one of mild, pleased surprise. The look of a woman who had expected to work alone and found instead that she did not have to. Nora did not ask for instructions. She found the basin, filled it from the pump outside, washed her hands, and began slicing the bread that was cooling on the board without waiting to be invited. They worked together without much conversation and without any awkwardness, moving around each other in the small space with the unspoken negotiation of people who are both accustomed to knowing how a kitchen works. Nora noticed that Edith moved her dominant hand slightly when she needed to pass the larger knife, and adjusted without comment. Edith noticed that Nora kept her elbows in and her work tidy, and said nothing either, but the small approving shift in her expression said enough. It was, Nora thought, the most comfortable she had felt in a kitchen in years, perhaps ever. She did not examine why too closely. Callum appeared in the doorway just as Edith was setting the coffee on the table. He had clearly been working already. There was dust on his shirt and a smear of something dark on his forearm that was probably axle grease. He looked at the table and then at Nora with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite anything else she had a name for. He pulled out a chair and sat down. Roy came in behind him, nodded at Nora in the way he had of nodding, thorough and final, as though the greeting encompassed everything that needed to be said, and took his usual place at the end of the table. Nora poured the coffee. She was not sure why she did it. It was not her kitchen and not her coffee, and Edith was perfectly capable of pouring it herself. But Edith was busy with the eggs, and the pot was right there, and it seemed like the natural thing to do. She poured Edith's cup first, then Roy's, then she looked at Callum. He was watching her with a steadiness that had nothing demanding about it, simply present, simply there. She met his eyes for a moment. Then she poured his coffee and set the pot back on the iron rest. "Thank you," he said. 2 words. And he said them the way he said most things. Quietly, without flourish, as though they were simply the accurate response to what had just happened. Not gratitude performed for an audience, just gratitude. She sat down and helped herself to bread, and the 4 of them ate breakfast in the particular comfortable silence of people who are tired and hungry and in each other's company without needing to prove anything by it. After the dishes were cleared, Callum appeared again at the cabin door just as Nora was drying her hands. She had expected him to go straight back to whatever work the morning held. There was clearly no shortage of it on a ranch this size, run with only 2 permanent hands, and whatever help could be brought in for larger jobs. Instead, he stood in the doorway with a quality of slight uncertainty that was new on him, as though he had decided to say something and was still negotiating the precise form of it. "I was going to work with the horses this morning," he said finally. "If you wanted to come, you don't have to." She looked at him. "I don't know anything about horses." "I know." She considered this for a moment. 3 days was a long time to fill in a place where she knew no one and had no particular reason to stay in one spot. And there was something about the idea of learning a thing, even a small thing, even a temporary thing, that appealed to her in a way she couldn't quite dismiss. "All right," she said. The horse he brought out for her was a chestnut mare named Clover, older and considerably more patient than the other animals in the corral, with a broad, plain face and eyes that conveyed a vast and benevolent indifference to the anxieties of the humans around her. Callum saddled her with the practiced efficiency of someone who had done it 10,000 times, narrating each step in the same low, measured voice he used for everything else, not talking down, just providing information she didn't have. Nora stood and watched and paid attention. This was also something she was good at. When it was time to mount, she was honest about the fact that she had no idea what she was doing, and he positioned the horse alongside the fence rail and explained the mechanics of it. Left foot in the stirrup, weight on the ball of the foot, not the heel, push up and swing through. Don't clutch the horn unless you need it. She did it wrong the first time, slightly wrong the second time, and nearly correct on the third attempt, which landed her in the saddle with her heart beating considerably faster than the situation probably warranted. The ground was farther away than it looked from down there. "Easy," Callum said. He was standing at Clover's head, one hand on the bridle, looking up at Nora with an expression that might have been the beginning of something amused if it had been given room to develop. "She can feel when you're nervous. Take a breath." "I'm not nervous," Nora said. "You're holding the saddle horn hard enough to leave marks." She released it, took a breath, as instructed, forced her shoulders down from where they had climbed to somewhere near her ears. Clover shifted her weight slightly beneath her, and Nora's entire body tensed in response, and the horse settled again immediately, as though this had been a test she had not meant to administer. "There," Callum said. "Now, your spine. Stop trying to balance by going stiff. The horse is doing the balancing. Your job is just to stay loose and let her." This was, Nora discovered over the following hour, considerably more difficult than it sounded. Everything in her instincts told her to grip harder when she felt uncertain, to tighten and control. And everything Callum told her was the opposite of that. Release, follow, allow. Trust the animal beneath you more than you trust your own attempt at control. She was not, by nature or by history, a person who found that easy, but she kept trying. And after a while, a long while, and several moments of white-knuckled recalibration, something shifted, just slightly. The tension in her lower back eased by a degree. Her hips began to absorb the small movement of the mare's walk instead of fighting it. And for approximately 4 seconds, she was simply sitting on a horse in the morning sun, in a place she had never intended to be, and the ground was far away, and the sky was enormous overhead, and it was, against all reasonable expectation, quite wonderful. "There it is," Callum said quietly. She looked down at him. He was watching her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face yet. Open, unguarded, the corners of his eyes slightly creased. Not quite a smile, but the shape that precedes one. "What?" she said. "When you stopped fighting it." He looked away, back toward the mountains. "That's when you're actually riding." They walked Clover around the flat area near the corral for another 20 minutes, Callum at the bridle, talking her through small adjustments. The angle of her wrists, the placement of her weight, the way a subtle shift of her hips could communicate direction. He was a good teacher in the way that people are good teachers when they love the subject. He never made her feel foolish for not knowing, and he never seemed bored by the repetition of explaining things clearly. When he finally helped her down, her legs were unsteady beneath her, and she was fairly certain she would be deeply, comprehensively sore by evening. But she stood on the ground and looked back up at Clover and felt a small, fierce bloom of something she recognized after a moment as pride. "You didn't fall off," Callum observed. "I thought about it," she admitted, and he laughed. It was quiet and brief, that laugh, but it was real. It came from somewhere genuine, and it changed the whole architecture of his face in a way that caught her slightly off guard. He looked, for just that moment, like a man who laughed easily, like a man who had once laughed easily and had not quite forgotten how. She stored that away without meaning to. The morning had shifted into the white heat of early afternoon by the time she walked back to the cabin to wash and change, and it was in that stretch of quiet time, while Edith rested and Roy worked in the barn and the ranch dozed under the overhead sun, that Nora went looking for something to do with her hands and found the storage room. It was a small room off the back of the cabin that served as a combination pantry, supply closet, and what appeared to be the primary location where every piece of paperwork generated by the operation of the ranch came to rest. Not in any organized fashion, in the fashion of papers that had been set down with the intention of being sorted later, repeatedly, over what appeared to be several years. She stood in the doorway for a moment and looked at it. The practical side of her mind, the part that had been keeping accounts since she was 14 and had discovered that her aunt's household was spending considerably more than it needed to on laundry supplies because no one was checking the invoices. That part of her mind lit up with a familiar, focused interest. She told herself she was just looking for something to do. She sat down on the floor of the storage room with the stack of papers and began to go through them. Not organizing at first, just reading, getting a sense of the shape of things, what came in, what went out, what was paid for, and when and by whom, and at what rate. She was perhaps halfway through the first stack when she found the first irregularity. It was small, a discrepancy between the amount written on a delivery receipt and the amount recorded in the corresponding payment ledger. The difference was modest, not the kind of thing you would notice unless you were reading both documents side by side and happened to be the kind of person who automatically checked columns against each other. She set it aside and kept reading. By the time she reached the bottom of the second stack, she had found 4 more. They were all small. They were all consistent in their direction. Always slightly more paid out than the goods received would justify, always rounded to amounts that looked plausible at a glance. And they were all associated with a single supplier name, written in the same neat hand across every document, Drover and Sons Provision. She opened her notebook and began to write. She was still writing when she heard boots on the path outside, and then a knock at the cabin door that was not Callum's knock. Too sharp, too deliberate. The knock of someone making a point through the medium of their knuckles. She went to the door. The man standing on the path was perhaps 50, with the kind of solid build that had probably once been impressive and had since settled into something that still commanded attention without earning it. He was dressed well for a working town, not ostentatiously, but with the care of a person who understood that appearance was a kind of argument. His eyes were pale and quick, moving over Nora's face with an assessment that was efficient and somehow unpleasant, like being measured for something she hadn't agreed to be fitted for. "Silas Drover," he said. His voice had the practiced warmth of a man who was accustomed to being liked and considered it a professional tool. "I'm here to see Adair about his standing order." "Mister, Adair is in the barn," Nora said. She kept her expression pleasant and her voice even, but as Drover smiled and thanked her and turned to go, his gaze dropped for just a moment, not to her face, not to anything that would have been impolite to look at, but to her hands. Specifically, to the notebook that she had not realized she was still carrying, tucked against her side. He looked at it for less than a second. Then he looked back up at her face, and the smile didn't change at all. And he walked away toward the barn. Nora stood in the doorway and watched him go. Then she went inside and wrote his name in the notebook and underlined it twice. She was in the kitchen helping Edith prepare supper when she heard Callum and Drover talking outside, the low, casual cadence of what appeared to be a routine business conversation. Drover's voice did most of the work. Callum's responses were brief and noncommittal, the way they were when he was being polite but not engaged. She listened without appearing to. And when the sound of horses' hooves on the path told her drover had ridden away, she finished chopping the onions and did not say anything. Not yet. The afternoon stretched into the gold of early evening, and Nora tied on an apron she found hanging by the kitchen door and worked alongside Edith in a companionship that had deepened somehow over the course of the day without either of them doing anything deliberate to encourage it. Edith told her about the ranch's first year, the drought that had nearly broken everything, the way Callum had worked himself half to death, and then got back up and worked some more, the quiet, steady manner in which Roy had simply refused to leave even when there were months without pay. "He doesn't ask for much," Edith said, meaning Callum, her hands moving efficiently through the vegetables on the board. "Doesn't talk much either, but he sees things clearly. People, situations." She paused. "He saw something in you when he brought you here. He doesn't do things without a reason." Nora said carefully, "He said I reminded him of someone." Edith was quiet for a moment. "Did he tell you who?" "No." Edith nodded slowly, as though this answered something she had been wondering. "He will," she said, "when he's ready." And then she picked up the conversation and moved it gently in a different direction, and Nora let it go. At supper, Drover's name came up naturally. Roy mentioned a delivery that had been short-counted on the last order, not with particular emphasis, just as a fact to be noted and corrected. Callum's jaw tightened by a fraction. He set his fork down and asked a question about the specifics, and Roy answered, and the conversation moved on. Nora looked at her plate and said nothing. After supper, she walked with Edith to the edge of the garden while the last of the daylight held. The mountains in the west had turned deep purple against a sky the color of cooling embers, and the air had finally relinquished the day's heat and become something almost gentle. "How long has Drover been supplying the ranch?" Nora asked. Edith glanced at her sideways. 3 years, she said. "Since before my time. Why?" "Just curious," Nora said. It was not quite a lie. She was curious. She was also something considerably more purposeful than curious, but she had not yet decided what to do with what she had found. And until she had decided, she kept it in the notebook and in her own mind, where it was safe. She was still thinking about it when she went into the main house the following morning. The day had taken on a different quality. Clouds building over the mountains to the west, the air carrying a faint metallic edge that Edith said usually meant weather coming, though it might be 2 days out, or it might be nothing. Callum had gone out early with Roy to check on the far pasture, and Nora found herself alone in the main room for the first time, with the bookshelves and the long table and the fireplace and the particular quality of silence that belongs to rooms that have been lived in genuinely. She ran her hand along the spines of the books, paused at the Whitman, pulled it out and opened it to a random page and read several lines standing there by the shelf, and felt something in her chest respond to the words the way it always did with certain kinds of writing. Not with emotion, exactly, but with recognition. The feeling of reading something true. She put it back. Then she went back to the storage room and picked up the notebook and began, very carefully, to verify every number she had found. By midday, she was certain. The total amount skimmed from Callum's accounts over 3 years was not enormous by some measures, but on a small ranch operating on careful margins, in a region prone to drought and weather events that could decimate a herd in a season, it was significant. It was the difference between expanding the operation and merely sustaining it. It was the difference between having a reserve against disaster and not having one. She closed the notebook. She thought about the fact that she was leaving on Thursday, that none of this was her concern or her business or her responsibility, that she had come here by accident and would be gone in 2 days, and the whole shape of her life was pointed at Teller Creek and the practical arrangements she had agreed to. She thought about the 4 seconds on Clover when she had stopped fighting and simply let the animal move beneath her. She thought about Edith's hands, always moving, always useful. About Roy's quiet, undemonstrative loyalty. About a pair of leather gloves folded on a shelf. She went back to the main room and sat down at the table by the window and was still sitting there, notebook open, when she heard Callum's boots on the porch. He came in without knocking. It was his house, and stopped when he saw her at the table. His expression moved through several things quickly. Surprise, question, something else she couldn't quite catch. He looked at the notebook. He looked at her face. "You found something," he said. It was not a question. "Yes," she said. She held the notebook out to him. He came to the table and took it, and stood reading while she watched him. His face was very still while he read, the kind of stillness that costs something to maintain. She watched his jaw tighten and release, watched his eyes move carefully across her columns of numbers, watched him turn back to the first page and read it through again. When he finally set the notebook down on the table, he looked at her for a moment without speaking. The afternoon light came through the window at a low angle and fell across the table between them. "You did this while you were waiting for Thursday," he said. "I couldn't sit still," she said. "And the numbers were right there." "You didn't have to." "I know," she said. "I did it anyway." Something moved through his expression, not quite the thing she had seen when he laughed, but related to it, quieter, deeper in. "How long has it been going on?" he asked. "At least 3 years," she said. "Probably from the beginning of the contract. The early records are incomplete, so I can't be certain of the total, but my best estimate is here." She pointed to the figure she had circled at the bottom of the last page. He looked at it for a long time. "Drover?" he said. "Yes." He was quiet. Roy had come in at some point during this, and was standing near the doorway, reading the room the way he read most situations, without rushing to fill the silence. "I should have checked more carefully," Callum said. "You were running a ranch with 2 people," Nora said. "You were managing everything else. He made it small enough not to trigger suspicion, and consistent enough to look like normal variation. That's not an excuse." "No," she agreed. "It's not. It's just a fact." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he had in the street on the first day, the full weight of his attention brought to bear. And she understood, under that look, that he was seeing something more than the notebook and the numbers. She was not certain she was ready for that, or what to do with it, but she did not look away. "Thank you, Miss Voss," he said, quietly, with a completeness that suggested the words were carrying more than their ordinary weight. "Nora," she said, and then was surprised that she had said it. A beat of silence passed between them, brief and particular and full of a quality she did not have a name for. Then Roy coughed, not quite discreetly, from his position near the doorway, and Callum looked down at the notebook again, and Nora straightened in her chair, and the moment passed. But it left something behind it. That evening, Nora was sitting on the cabin steps watching the last of the cloud-streaked sunset when she heard a different set of hoofbeats on the road, not from the direction of the pastures, but from the direction of town. She looked up. A wagon was coming through the gate. The man who climbed down from it was perhaps 40, neatly dressed in the clothes of a man who ran a business rather than a farm. Dark coat, clean hat, boots that had not seen much unpaved road before today. He was not unpleasant looking. He had a steady, open face and the posture of someone accustomed to meeting people and making them feel at ease. He looked around the property with an assessing but not unfriendly eye, and then he saw Nora on the steps. He took off his hat. "Miss Voss," he said, "I'm Edmund Fair. I believe you were meant to arrive in Teller Creek 2 days ago." Nora stood. Behind her she was aware of the main house door opening. Callum stepping out onto the porch, stopping. The three of them were still for a moment in the fading light, the space between them full of the particular charge of situations that have not yet declared themselves. Edmund Fair held his hat in both hands and looked at Nora with an expression that was patient and sincere and genuinely kind. Callum stood on the porch and said nothing at all, and Nora looked at Edmund Fair, at the reasonable, decent, carefully prepared life he represented, and felt the ground shift very slightly beneath her feet, the way it had on Clover's back just before she had learned to stop fighting and simply let the motion carry her. She said, "Mr. Fair, please come in." Edmund Fair sat in the main house with his hat on his knee and his hands folded over it, and he was exactly what he had appeared to be from the moment he stepped down from the wagon. Reasonable, patient, and genuinely kind in the way of a man who had thought carefully about what kind of person he wanted to be and had made a steady effort to become it. He did not make accusations. He did not perform injury. He looked at Nora across the table with the clear, direct gaze of someone who deserved an honest conversation, and so she gave him one. She told him about the stagecoach, about the name on the signpost and the name on her documents and the particular quality of helplessness that had come over her in the street that first afternoon. Though she did not describe it as helplessness, she described it as a logistical difficulty, because that was how she had experienced it at the time, or at least how she had allowed herself to experience it. She told him that Callum Adair had offered her shelter until the Thursday coach, and that Edith and Roy Pratt were present on the property, and that everything had been entirely proper. Edmund listened to all of this without interrupting. When she had finished, he nodded slowly, as though he was confirming something he had already partly understood. "I'm not here to collect you," he said. "I want to be clear about that. I came because I was concerned about your safety, not because I have any claim on your choices." Across the room, Callum was standing near the fireplace. He had not sat down. He had the quality, in that moment, of a man making a deliberate effort to be furniture, present but not participating, giving the conversation the space it needed without entirely removing himself from it. Edmund looked at him briefly, then back at Nora. "I thought we could talk," Edmund said, "about Teller Creek, about what I can offer. And then, whatever you decide, I'll respect it." It was, Nora thought, a remarkably decent thing to say. And it made the conversation that followed considerably more difficult than it would have been if he had been less decent about it. He spoke quietly and without embellishment about his life and his business, and the house he had prepared, and the life he believed they could build together. He was honest about the fact that he had not expected to find himself at 40 still unmarried, and honest about why. The demands of the business in its early years, the way time had passed more quickly than he had accounted for. He said that he had read her letters with genuine interest and had formed a good opinion of her mind and her character, and that he still held that opinion. I don't expect love immediately, he said, but I think it can grow. I think we're both practical enough to give it the conditions it needs. Nora looked at her hands on the table. She thought about practicality. She had built her entire life on it, had chosen it over and over as the only reliable alternative to hope, which in her experience tended to leave you standing in a street somewhere with the dust settling around your feet and no transportation and nowhere to go. You're a good man, Mr. Farr, she said. Edmund, he said gently. Edmund. She looked up at him. I need a day to think clearly. He nodded as though he had expected this. I'll stay in town tonight. We can speak again tomorrow. He stood, put his hat back on with the practiced gesture of a man always slightly more comfortable in motion than in stillness, and offered his hand. She shook it. His grip was firm and brief and honest. He looked at Callum on his way to the door. Mr. Adair, he said with neither warmth nor coldness, just acknowledgement. Mr. Farr, Callum said. And then Edmund was gone, the sound of his wagon fading into the blue distance of the evening, and the main room was very quiet. Callum had not moved from the fireplace. Nora had not moved from the table. The lamp on the mantel threw a warm, unsteady light across the space between them, and outside the window the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky, one by one, the way they always did out here, with a slowness that seemed deliberate, as though the night was building something it wanted you to notice. You should go to Teller Creek, Callum said. His voice was level, the kind of level that costs something. Nora looked at him. Is that what you think I should do? I think it's a reasonable life. He's a reasonable man. You didn't answer the question. A silence, long enough that the lamp flame bent slightly in some current of air neither of them could feel, and then steadied again. What do you want, Nora? He said. Not quite the same words as the night before, but close, closer. She stood up from the table and walked to the window and stood looking out at the mountains, which had gone from purple to black, against a sky that was deepening by the minute. She heard him cross the room behind her, not to where she was standing, but to the far end of the fireplace, putting himself somewhere in the middle distance between her and the door. I don't know, she said, which was the most honest thing she had said in a long time, and felt, accordingly, like standing at the edge of something high. She heard him exhale, slow, careful. Then think, he said. You have until tomorrow. She went back to the cabin. She did not sleep. The night outside the window was enormous and full of sound. Insects, wind in the dry grass, the distant call of some hunting bird. She lay on the narrow bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about Edmund Farr's patient, decent face and the life in Teller Creek that was organized and ready and waiting for her to step into it. She thought about the 10 years in her aunt's house and the man who had disappeared, and the careful, disciplined way she had rebuilt herself after each of those things into someone who did not require much from the world, and therefore was not often disappointed by it. She thought about 4 seconds on a horse, loose and carried and briefly, overwhelmingly free. Sometime past midnight, she gave up on sleep and went outside. The stars were extraordinary. She had stopped being surprised by them, or rather, she had become surprised by them in a different way, the way you become surprised by something you realize you have always been missing without knowing what it was you were missing. Callum was on the main house porch. She had not expected this, or perhaps she had, in the way you don't expect things you are somehow already moving toward. He was sitting in the single wooden chair on the porch, not doing anything, just sitting in the dark with his forearms on his knees and his eyes toward the mountains. He looked up when she came across the yard. He didn't say anything, but he didn't look away either. She came and sat on the porch step below the chair, which put her slightly below him and slightly to the side, and they were both quiet for a while in the particular way that had developed between them over 3 days. A silence that did not demand filling. "You don't sleep," she said eventually. "Not always." "How long?" A pause. "Since May died. 3 years, more or less." He said the name without preparation, without the careful lowering of voice that people use around grief they're still managing. Just said it, the way you say the name of someone who is simply true. "Some nights are better than others." Nora looked at her hands in her lap. "May was your wife." "Yes." The word was complete in itself. She waited, not pushing, the way she had learned that waiting sometimes opens things that pressure closes. After a long moment, he said, "She laughed at everything. Not in a careless way. In a way that meant she found the world genuinely funny, which I always thought was a kind of courage. It takes courage to find things funny when life keeps proving that it doesn't care whether you're having a good time or not." He was quiet again. She could light up a room just by walking into it. Not because she tried to, just because she was in it and glad to be. Nora listened to this the way she listened to the best things in the books on his shelf, with her whole attention and nothing in the way of it. "She died quickly," he said. "That's what they told me afterward, like it should be a comfort. She was sick, and then she was very sick, and then she was gone. And the whole thing from the first sign to the end was 11 days. Our son was 4. The sentence fell into the quiet with a weight that seemed to change the temperature of the air around it. He went 2 days after she did. The same illness. Nora did not move, did not speak. She understood that some things need to be said into stillness, and that the worst thing you can do is try to soften them before they've landed. "I built this place after," he said. "I had the land already, but I hadn't done much with it. After, I needed something to do with my hands, needed to build something because everything I'd built before was gone." A pause. "Some days I don't know what I'm building it for. Other days it feels like enough to just build it." Nora said very quietly, "What was his name? Your son?" A breath. "Samuel." She let the name rest in the air between them. "My parents died when I was 12, she said. Not as an equivalence. She wasn't offering it as that. But as a kind of reciprocity. One true thing offered in response to another. A fever outbreak. There were 2 weeks between the first sign and the end of it, and then I was in my aunt's house, and nothing was ever the same again." She paused. "I used to think about them every day. Now it's more like they're always there, in the background of everything. The way the mountains are always there, even when you're not looking at them." He looked at her then, full and direct, the full weight of those gray-blue eyes in the dark. "Yes," he said, "exactly like that." They sat in the quiet for a long time after that. The stars moved their slow, imperceptible arc overhead. The mountains were black shapes against the slightly less dark sky. Somewhere out beyond the corral, one of the horses made a soft sound and was answered by another. Then Callum stood up from the chair. He went inside, and she heard him moving in the house. The sound of a drawer, of something being lifted and carried. When he came back out, he was holding something she recognized, the leather gloves, the woman's gloves from the shelf in the sitting room. He stood in front of her and looked at them in his hands for a moment. Then he sat back down in the chair and set them on the arm of it where she could see them clearly. These were May's, he said. She wore them for everything. Work, riding, anything outside. She had small hands. He touched the edge of one with his fingertip. I've kept them on that shelf because I couldn't figure out what else to do with them. Putting them away felt like... He stopped, started again. I've never been able to decide if keeping them there is holding on or just remembering. I'm still not sure there's a difference. Nora looked at the gloves, at his face above them, which was open in a way she had not seen it before, not vulnerable in the way of someone breaking, but open in the way of someone who has decided, carefully and at some cost, to allow themselves to be seen. There is a difference, she said gently. Holding on is when you can't move. Remembering is when you can move, and you take them with you. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said so quietly she almost missed it. I haven't been able to move. I know, she said. The words fell between them without drama, without performance. Just the plain acknowledgement of one person who has been standing still for a long time being seen by another. And something in the quality of the silence after them was different from all the silences before. Slightly warmer, slightly less alone. The next morning came with the metallic smell of distant weather and a wind off the mountains that bent the grass in long silver waves across the open ground. Nora was up before sunrise. She went to the storage room and took out the notebook and carried it to the table by the window in the main room, which Callum had apparently left unlocked for her sometime in the night, and she sat down and finished her accounting with the clear, concentrated focus of someone who has decided to finish a thing properly. When Callum came in from the morning's first round of work, she was ready. She laid the notebook open on the table and talked him through it from beginning to end, not just the totals, but the pattern, the method, the careful way Drover had structured the discrepancies to avoid triggering any single obvious alarm. She showed him which delivery receipts to cross-reference, which ledger entries were irregular, and where the numbers diverged most significantly from what the records should have shown. Callum sat across from her and listened with complete attention. He asked 2 questions, both precise, both indicating that he had understood what she'd said before asking them. He did not interrupt. When she finished, he sat for a moment with his forearms on the table, looking at the open notebook, and then he looked at her. This took you the better part of 2 days, he said. It wasn't difficult. The information was all there. It just needed someone to sit with it. You were leaving Thursday, he said. I'm aware. You did this anyway. She met his eyes. I couldn't see something wrong and leave it wrong. I'm not built that way. He looked at her for a long moment with a directness that had nothing guarded about it. Then he said, I know. As though he had known it from the beginning. As though it was one of the first things he had understood about her. The afternoon brought Drover. He arrived without a wagon this time, on horseback, with the easy confidence of a man who had been conducting a profitable arrangement for 3 years without interference, and had no particular reason to expect any now. He dismounted at the gate and came across the yard toward the main house, and Nora, who was returning from the garden with Edith, watched him come with the particular stillness of someone who is paying very careful attention to how a person moves when they think no one important is watching. He moved like a man who was comfortable, too comfortable, in the specific way of people whose comfort is built on something they haven't acknowledged as fragile. Callum came out of the barn as Drover reached the porch. Roy was somewhere behind them, quiet and present in the way he always was. Roy's particular skill was being thoroughly accounted for without ever making it obvious that he was accounting for everything. The conversation that followed was brief. Callum presented 2 of the discrepant receipts, just 2, carefully chosen, and asked Drover in his level, unhurried voice to explain the difference between what had been delivered and what had been charged. He didn't accuse. He simply asked in the tone of a man who already knows the answer and is giving the other person the opportunity to respond with whatever dignity they can manage. Drover's comfortable expression did not exactly collapse. It shifted, rearranged itself into something slightly different while the calculation behind his eyes ran through its options. He said there must have been a clerical error. He said it convincingly, the way a man says something he is prepared to say. Callum told him he would be reviewing all contracts going forward and that the current arrangement would not be continuing. He said it without heat, without satisfaction, without anything that could be called aggression. He simply said it the way he said everything, as the accurate statement of what was true. Drover left. He rode out of the gate and down the road without looking back, and Nora, watching from the edge of the garden, wrote nothing in her notebook because there was nothing left to write. It was already there. Every number, every discrepancy, every date, complete and documented and no longer hidden. She became aware of Callum standing beside her. He was simply there, in the way he had of appearing without announcement, his gaze following Drover's retreating figure until it disappeared around the bend in the road. "Thank you," he said, quietly, meaning it entirely. "You would have found it eventually," she said. "Maybe, but you found it now." He looked at her. "And you didn't have to." She said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't reduce something that was better left at its full size. The evening was soft and pale gold, the threatened weather having decided against arriving today, leaving behind only a gentleness in the air that was different from the usual dry heat. Edith made a supper that was better than necessity required, a small, unspoken acknowledgement of something, though no one named what. And the 4 of them sat around the table and ate with the ease of people who have been through a thing together and come out the other side of it still themselves. After supper, Callum asked if she wanted to see the ridge. He said it simply, the way he said most things, and she said yes, the way she had been saying yes to things for 3 days, that her careful, practical self would previously have declined. They saddled Clover and his bay gelding in the long evening light, and he helped her mount without her asking, his hand briefly at her elbow, warm and certain, there and gone, and they rode out together toward the hillside that rose behind the north pasture. The ridge was not high by the standards of the mountains behind it, but it was high enough. When they reached the top and dismounted, the whole valley lay below them in the last of the day's light. The ranch small and purposeful in its hollow, the road running north through the pale grass, the mountains enormous and permanent on all sides, the sky above them doing what the sky out here did every evening without fail, and without any concern for whether anyone was watching. They stood side by side and did not speak for a while, which was by now entirely natural between them. Then Callum said, without preamble, without build-up, without any of the circling that most people do around the things they most need to say, "Stay, Nora." the word moved through her like the wind moved through the grass below. All the way through, touching everything. Not as a practical arrangement, he said. Not because it's convenient or because the timing works out, because in 3 days you've seen more of this place than most people see in 3 years. Because you found what was wrong and you fixed it, not because anyone asked you to, but because that's who you are. Because every time I look up, you're already there. A pause. Because the thought of you getting on that coach Thursday and going to Teller Creek and becoming someone else's practical arrangement feels like a loss I'm not willing to have without at least saying so. Nora looked out at the valley. The last edge of the sun was touching the mountain peaks and turning them briefly, brilliantly gold, before it slipped below and left everything in the blue of early dark. She was aware of every detail of the moment with absolute clarity. The smell of dry grass and approaching evening, the warmth of the horse at her back, the faint silver light beginning to collect in the sky above the eastern ridge where the stars would soon appear. The way his voice had sounded saying her name, not like he was calling for her, but like he was simply stating a fact about something that mattered. She opened her mouth to answer, and then, from the direction of the ranch below, a sharp sound rose through the quiet evening air. A crack, and then a shout, and then the unmistakable smell of smoke. She turned. The coppery light on the horizon was not the last of the sunset. Callum was already moving before she had fully processed what she was seeing. He swung up onto the bay gelding in one motion and was down the ridge at a gallop before Nora had her foot in Clover's stirrup. She mounted without thinking, without the careful calculation she had applied to every previous attempt, and followed him down the slope with her hands low and her weight back the way he had taught her. And Clover responded to her urgency with a sureness that left no room for fear. The barn was on fire. Not entirely, not yet. The flames had taken hold on the eastern wall and were moving upward with the hungry, methodical patience of fire that has been properly set, not accidentally started. The dry timber caught and released light in long, bright pulses, and the smell was enormous, filling the whole hollow of the valley with something acrid and irreversible. Roy was already at the water trough with a bucket, which was the correct instinct, and also, against the scale of what was burning, not nearly enough. Edith was at the corral gate, working the latch with hands that were perfectly steady, because Edith's hands were always steady. Nora did not stop at the corral. She rode Clover to the far side of the barn, to the smaller door that Roy had not reached yet, the one that opened onto the stalls where 3 horses were already throwing themselves against the wood in blind, instinctive panic. She dismounted, tied Clover's reins fast to the fence post at a distance, and went to the door. The heat on the other side of it was significant. She could feel it through the wood before she touched the latch. She lifted the hem of her skirt, wrapped it around her hand, and opened the door. The smoke was thick and low, and the horses inside were no longer making organized noise. Just the flat, terrified sound of animals that have run out of specific fears and arrived at the one underneath all the others. She went in low, below the worst of the smoke, and found the first stall by feel as much as sight. The horse inside, a young roan she had seen Callum working with, was pressed against the far corner. She unlatched the stall door and stepped inside and put her hand flat on the animal's neck, not gentle, firm, the way Callum had shown her, and pushed with her body weight, and the roan lurched forward, and she guided it out through the main door and into the open air. She went back for the second and the third. By the time she came out with the last one, a gray mare who had decided to become completely immovable and had to be encouraged out by a combination of Nora pushing from behind and making sounds she could not have reproduced consciously, the wall above the stall doorway was fully involved, and the smoke had dropped to a level that required her to move bent nearly double. She came out into the night air and straightened and coughed until her eyes watered and her throat felt scraped clean. Callum was there. He was right there, 5 feet from the door. And when she came through it, he crossed the distance between them in 2 steps and took hold of her by the shoulders. Not gently, with the grip of someone who had been watching a door and not knowing what was going to come through it. He looked at her face, her hands, her arms, checking. "I'm fine," she said, still coughing. His grip did not release. "Callum." She looked up at him. "I'm fine. The horses are out." He looked at her for a moment longer with an expression that had abandoned all its usual careful restraint and was simply, plainly, fear in the process of becoming relief. Then he let her go, and she felt the absence of his hands on her shoulders, the way you feel the absence of warmth. He looked at the barn. The eastern wall was gone now, fully consumed, the fire moving across the roof with a slow, terrible thoroughness. There was nothing to save in that wall. The water Roy was throwing at the western side might save the structure. It might not. They worked through the night to give it the best chance they could, all 4 of them, and by the time the sky began to lighten in the east, the fire was out, and the barn was still standing, and the eastern wall was not. Just the frame, charred and exposed, open to the morning air like a wound. Callum stood in front of it with his arms at his sides. His face was unreadable in the way it sometimes was. Not blank, but too full for any single thing to surface clearly. He looked at the burned wall for a long time. She watched his hands, which had been fists during most of the night, slowly open and release. He breathed out through his nose, slow and deliberate. "It was set," Roy said from somewhere to Nora's left. Not a question. "Yes," Callum said. "The fire started on the outside of the east wall," Roy said. "Nothing in that corner to start it on its own. No lantern, no lamp. Something was placed against the boards." Nora thought of Drover's face when he had ridden away. The particular quality of his expression, not quite defeated, not quite finished. The face of a man who was reclassifying the nature of the problem. She did not say this out loud. There would be time for it later. Right now, Callum was standing in front of a wall that was not there anymore, and the only thing that was required of this moment was to be in it with him. She went and stood beside him, not touching, not speaking, just there. After a while, he said, "The horses are all right." "Yes," she said, "you got them out." Roy would have gotten to them. Roy was on the other side of the building. He turned his head and looked at her. In the pale early light, his face was tired and soot-marked and entirely without pretense. "You didn't run. Most people run." "I had 3 days of riding lessons," she said. "I felt I owed the horses something." The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite the laugh from the morning with Clover, but related to it. They were still standing there when Edmund Fair's wagon came through the gate. He had seen the smoke from town, he said, and had come out at first light to make certain everyone was accounted for. He looked at the burned wall, and then at the 4 of them, tired and marked with soot, and to his credit, he asked what needed to be done, and went and did it, without making the moment about anything else. It was, Nora thought, a very decent thing to do. She kept noticing this about Edmund, the consistent, unperformed decency of him, and she kept setting it beside the other thing, the thing she could not look at directly, and trying to understand the difference between the two. Decency was not the same as the feeling of standing on a ridge at dusk with the whole valley spread out below, and someone saying her name like a statement of fact. But decency was real and lasting and reliable in a way that feelings on ridges at dusk were not necessarily any of those things, and she was, at her core, a person who trusted what was real and lasting and reliable. She was still thinking about this when Mrs. Whitfield arrived. The older woman came on foot from the direction of the road, with two other women from the town whom Nora had seen once or twice in the street, and she had the expression of someone arriving with a purpose that had been organized in advance of having full information about the situation. She looked at the burned barn wall. She looked at Callum and Roy and Edith. She looked at Edmund and then at Nora, and the calculation in her gaze was not subtle. "I came to make sure no one was hurt," she said, addressing herself primarily to Callum, in the tone of a woman who is performing concern while conducting an inquiry. "And to say that the town has been talking about the situation here." A pause, precise, practiced, with the young woman. "Miss Voss has been a guest on this property," Callum said. His voice was level. "Edith and Roy have been present throughout." "Of course," Mrs. Whitfield said, in a way that meant she was noting the response and moving past it. "Still, people wonder. She came here meant for someone else, and she stayed on, and now—" She gestured vaguely at the barn, as though the fire were somehow continuous with the other irregularities. "Well, people will draw their own conclusions." Nora looked at her. She felt very calm, which was how she knew she was genuinely angry. Her anger had always been cold rather than hot, a clarifying chill rather than a flood. She thought about 10 years in her aunt's house, where similar calculations had been performed about her regularly and with less justification. She thought about the way Mrs. Whitfield was looking at her, not as a person whose name and history and interior life were fully their own, but as a variable in a social equation that had little to do with her actual self. She drew breath to respond. Callum spoke first. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, and something in the way he said the name, quiet, final, allowing no misunderstanding about the register he was speaking in, brought the woman's attention fully to him. "I'm going to ask you to take your concerns back to town with you. Miss Voss has conducted herself with complete integrity since the moment she arrived, and anyone who says otherwise is speaking without knowledge of the facts." Mrs. Whitfield's expression rearranged itself. "I meant no offense, Mr. Adair. I'm simply saying what people are—" "I know what you're saying," he said, "and I've told you what I have to say in response. Good morning." It was not a dismissal that invited negotiation. Mrs. Whitfield understood this, and she gathered herself and the two women who had come with her, and she left. The sound of her departure, the tight, dignified footsteps on the dry ground, said everything about her feelings on the matter, and nothing that would require Callum to respond to any of it. Edmund, who had been standing at a slight distance during this exchange, met Nora's eyes briefly. Something in his expression had shifted. Not dramatically, just a small, precise adjustment. The look of a man who has received new information and is integrating it honestly. He went back to helping Roy. Nora stood in the yard for a moment. in the thin morning light with the smell of smoke still on everything, and felt the weight of the last 12 hours settle across her shoulders. She was tired in a way that went beyond the physical. Tired of the calculation that living in the world required of a woman who had nothing to offer but herself, and was therefore always having to prove that herself was enough. She went into the cabin and sat on the edge of the narrow bed and put her face in her hands. She was not crying. She was doing what she always did when things became loud and complicated and full of other people's requirements. She went still and quiet and let herself feel the actual shape of things beneath the noise. The actual shape of things was this: there was a man in the yard who was reliable and kind and had prepared a life for her with genuine good intentions. And there was another man who had looked at her on a ridge the night before and said things that had rearranged something fundamental in how she understood what was possible, and who had crossed the yard this morning and put his hands on her shoulders and looked at her face in a way that had nothing practical about it and nothing cautious. Just the plain, exposed fact of someone who was afraid of losing something they had not finished realizing they needed. She was afraid too. That was the part she could not get past. The knowledge of what it cost to love something and lose it. She had been 12 years old, and the people she loved most had been gone in 11 days. And she had spent the 10 years since constructing a life that was small enough and controlled enough and practical enough that losing parts of it would not break her the way that first loss had. And then she had gotten off a stagecoach at the wrong stop. The knock at the cabin door was Edmund's. She opened it, and he stood on the porch with his hat in his hands. Always the hat, she thought. Always that small gesture of respect. And his face had the quality of a man who has decided to be completely honest, even if honesty is not what he would prefer. "May I sit?" he said. She stepped aside. He came in and sat in the rocking chair in the small sitting room and looked at the empty shelf where the leather gloves had been. They were back in the main house now, she realized. And then he looked at her. "I want to say something," he said, "and I want to say it clearly so there's no uncertainty between us." He looked down at the hat in his hands for a moment, then back up. "I came here hoping to leave with you. I'm leaving without you. And I think you should understand that this is not a failure of what we might have been. It's just that what we might have been is not what you need, or what I want for you, if I'm honest about it." Nora looked at him carefully. "Edmund, I watched him look at you this morning," he said simply, "when you came out of that barn. And I understood something I should probably have understood sooner." He smiled, and it was a real smile. Not performed, not brave, just genuine in the way the man himself was genuine. "I'm a practical person. I thought I was looking for a practical partner. But what I watched this morning was not practical. And I found, to my surprise, that I am not so practical that I can ask you to settle for something less than that." Nora sat down on the edge of the bed and looked at him for a long moment. "You're a very good man," she said. "I'm trying to be," he said. "I expect I'll find someone who loves me specifically. I think that's probably better for everyone." He stood and put on his hat and held out his hand. She stood and took it. His grip was the same as it had been the evening before, firm and brief and honest. Then he went to the door and opened it, and the morning light came in around him, and he turned back once. "He's going to need to hear it from you," he said. "Clearly. Men like that need clarity." A pause. Don't make him wait too long. Then he was gone, and the sound of his wagon on the road faded north, and the cabin was very quiet. Nora stood in the middle of the small room for a moment. Then she picked up her notebook from the table. She opened it to the last page with writing on it. The columns of figures, Drover's name underlined twice. She turned to the next blank page and stood looking at it for a moment. Then she closed the notebook, picked up her coat, and went out. The yard was quiet in the mid-morning light. Edith was somewhere inside. Roy was in what remained of the barn, assessing what could be salvaged and what would need to come down. The horses were in the corral, composed now, grazing with the pragmatic serenity of animals that have been frightened and are no longer frightened, and see no reason to dwell on the difference. Callum was sitting on the top rail of the corral fence, looking at nothing in particular, or looking at everything at once, which was sometimes the same thing. She crossed the yard and stood beside the fence and did not say anything immediately. He looked down at her. He had washed the soot from his face and hands, but his shirt was still marked with it, and he looked tired in the way of someone who has been awake for a long time and is running on something that is not quite energy, but is serving the same purpose. Edmund left, she said. I know. A pause. I heard the wagon. She looked at the horses. The roan she had brought out of the barn was at the far end of the corral, pulling at the hay with uncomplicated appetite. She watched him for a moment. He said something to me before he left, she said. He said, men like you need clarity. He told me not to make you wait too long. Callum was very still. He was right about the first part, she said. She turned and looked up at him, at his tired, unguarded face in the morning light, at the gray-blue eyes that had been seeing her clearly since the moment he had set her trunk down on his shoulder and walked her to a wagon without explaining why he was doing it. I want to tell you something, clearly, without qualification. He waited. I'm afraid, she said. I want you to understand that part first, because it's true, and I won't pretend it isn't. I know what it costs to love something and lose it. I've known that since I was 12 years old, and I've been very careful ever since not to put myself in a position where I would have to know it again. She paused, let the silence hold what it needed to hold. And then I got off a stagecoach at the wrong stop. He had not moved. He was watching her with the full, steady attention she had stopped trying to deflect. I'm still afraid, she said, but I think being afraid of the wrong things is its own kind of loss, and I have been afraid of the wrong things for a very long time. A long moment. Then he climbed down from the fence rail and stood in front of her. He was close enough that she had to look up to meet his eyes, and the morning light fell across his face and showed her every line and mark and year of it, and she thought that she had never seen a face she trusted more completely. What are you saying, Nora? He said, quietly, needing to hear the words. She looked at him steadily. I'm saying I want to stay, she said. Not until Thursday. Not as a practical arrangement. She breathed out slowly. I'm saying I want to stay because when I imagine getting on that coach and watching this place disappear behind me, something in me refuses to accept it. And I have learned, slowly and at considerable cost, to pay attention when something in me refuses. Callum looked at her for a long moment with those gray-blue eyes that missed nothing and performed nothing, and the whole ranch was quiet around them, the horses, the charred barn, the mountains permanent and indifferent in the distance. And then he reached out and took her hand, not dramatically, just took it, the way you take hold of something you intend to keep. his rough palm warm against her fingers. She did not pull away. She stood in the thin morning light in the yard of a ranch she had arrived at by accident 3 days ago, and she held the hand of a man she had not known existed until she stepped off a stagecoach at the wrong stop. And she felt something she had been guarding against for 10 careful years crack open quietly in her chest and let the light in. Not all at once, not with any particular drama, just in, the way the dawn came in out here, slowly, and then everywhere at once. The wedding was small. This was not a compromise or a diminishment. It was simply the accurate size of the thing, the size that fit what it actually was rather than what convention might have suggested it should be. There were 4 people present, Edith and Roy as witnesses, and a reverend from town named Hatch, who had a kind, unhurried face, and the manner of a man who had officiated at enough ceremonies to understand that the ones that mattered most were rarely the largest ones. He rode out to the ranch on a morning when the light was the particular pale gold of early autumn, the air carrying for the first time a faint edge of something cooler beneath the usual dry warmth, a suggestion that the season was preparing to become something different. He stood on the porch of the main house and opened his book and looked at the 2 people in front of him with the steady, attentive warmth of someone who takes his work seriously and has never stopped finding it remarkable. Nora wore the blue dress she had packed for traveling, the one she had folded carefully at the bottom of the trunk with the vague, unexamined hope that it might be suitable for something important. It was cotton, faded slightly at the seams from washing, and it fit her the way clothes fit a person who has never had the luxury of acquiring things purely for beauty. Edith had pressed it that morning without being asked, with the silent efficiency of a woman who considers ceremony important and sentiment private. She had also, somewhere between breakfast and the hour of the ceremony, produced a small cluster of late-season wildflowers, pale yellow, the color of dry grass catching afternoon light, which she pressed into Nora's hands without comment or explanation, simply placed them there and walked away before Nora could say anything about it. Callum wore the dark coat that lived at the back of the wardrobe and came out for occasions. He was uncomfortable in it, visibly, in the entirely endearing way that men who spend most of their lives in work clothes are uncomfortable in anything that does not allow them to move freely and reach things and get on with the business of the day. But he wore it without complaint, and when Nora came out of the cabin and crossed the yard toward him in the early morning light with Edith's wildflowers in her hands, the expression that moved across his face made the coat entirely irrelevant to any assessment of him. He looked at her the way he looked at the mountains sometimes, with the particular, complete quality of attention reserved for things that are simply, wholly real. Reverend Hatch read the words he read at such occasions, and they spoke their parts back to him, and the words fell into the quiet morning with a weight and a lightness that seemed to belong equally to the moment. When it came to Callum's vows, he held both her hands in his rough palms warm and certain around her fingers, and he said things that were not elaborate and not performed, and were therefore far more than either of those things would have been. He said he would work beside her. He said he would listen when she spoke and mean it when he answered. He said that he had spent 3 years building something without understanding what it was for, and that he understood now, and that he intended to spend whatever years remained to him being worthy of the understanding. Nora said that she had arrived at this place by accident and intended to stay on purpose. She said she would bring everything she had, every skill and every stubbornness and every careful, hard-won piece of herself, to whatever they were building together. She said that she had learned, at some cost and over considerable time, that the things worth having are usually the things that frighten you most, and that she was no longer willing to be careful in ways that meant being without him. Roy made a sound at the back of his throat that was not quite a cough. Edith looked at the mountains with great and sudden interest. Reverend Hatch smiled the smile of a man who has been doing this long enough to know that most ceremonies are performances of the thing, and that occasionally, not often, but occasionally, he is present for the thing itself. After, Edith made a meal that was considerably better than the occasion technically required, which was her way of marking something without making a speech about it. They ate together at the long table in the main room with the windows open to the autumn morning, and Roy told a story that had nothing to do with weddings or romance or any of the events of the past week. A story about a mule he had worked with the previous spring that had opinions about directions, and everyone laughed, and that was the ceremony's proper ending. Not the words on the porch, but this. The four of them at the table, in the ordinary light of a day that had become different from all the days before it. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that Nora had no previous experience of, and therefore no existing name for. The feeling of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly the work she was meant to do, with exactly the right person beside her. She understood intellectually that this particular quality of feeling would not sustain itself at this intensity indefinitely, that ordinary life would eventually reassert its ordinary texture with all its frictions and complications and days when nothing went right. She found she did not mind the prospect in the least. Ordinary life with room in it, with space to be entirely herself, to be seen and known and valued for the specific things she actually was rather than the general category of useful person she had occupied for most of her 22 years, was something she had never had before, and she intended to find it entirely sufficient. She took over the ranch accounts formally, which was less a decision than a recognition of what had already been happening. She organized the storage room properly, cross-referenced every outstanding contract against the delivery records, and built a ledger system that made the numbers clear and verifiable at a glance. The work took 3 days of concentrated effort, and she found it deeply satisfying in the way that work is satisfying when you are doing it for something that is yours. Not yours in the sense of possession, but yours in the sense of belonging to, which she was coming to understand was a different and better thing. She also wrote a careful, thorough letter documenting Drover's practice, the method, the duration, the precise figures, and sent it to the head of the Valley's Merchants' Council, a body of senior traders who handled disputes of this kind among themselves, quietly and with finality. She wrote it without anger, because anger was not what she felt. What she felt was the clean, purposeful satisfaction of someone who has found something that needed to be set right and has set it right, and who can now put it down. The letter went out on a Thursday morning. She did not think about Drover again. Word reached them, some weeks later, that Drover had been turned away by 2 other ranches in the valley before the season's end. Nora noted it without satisfaction, the way you note a thing that has resolved itself correctly and requires nothing further from you. The notebook acquired new pages, ranch figures and seed prices, and a running proposal for a small lending library she had begun to believe the town might actually support, given the right approach and the right conversation with the right people at the right time. Sketched plans for expanding Edith's garden, Notes from conversations with Roy about the horses, who were particular animals with particular temperaments, and whose particular temperaments, she was discovering, were worth knowing in detail. The pages that held Drover's name underlined twice were still there at the beginning. She did not remove them, because a record was more honest with its difficult parts left in. But they were no longer the most recent thing in the book, and that was its own kind of statement about the passage of time. Callum rebuilt the eastern wall of the barn. He worked on it in the early mornings before the heat built, Roy beside him, and often Nora nearby with the accounts or the planning notebook or whatever needed doing, close enough to be present without being in the way of the work. She learned the rhythm of it gradually, the sound of good timber going up, the way a structure that looks insufficient at each stage suddenly becomes coherent when the final piece is in place. The particular economy of communication between two men who have worked alongside each other long enough that most of what needs to be said can be said without words. One morning, she was sitting on an upturned crate going through the figures for the winter supply order when she became aware that the hammering had stopped. She looked up. Callum was on the ladder, level with the top of the new wall, and he was looking at her with the kind of steadiness that, she had come to understand, was simply how he regarded things he cared about. "Come and see," he said. She climbed the ladder. From the top of the new wall, the whole valley was visible. The ranch below, compact and purposeful in its hollow, the road running north through the pale autumn grass, the mountains on all sides under the enormous sky, everything washed in the clear light of a morning that had nothing to conceal. "It's good work," she said. "Yes," he said, meaning the same thing she was meaning, which was not only the wall. He put his hand over hers on the top rail, the way he had taken her hand in the yard the morning after the fire, without ceremony, without hesitation, with complete and quiet intention. And they stood there for a moment in the good light, with the whole of the world they were building spread out beneath them, and the whole of the future spread out somewhere beyond the mountains, not visible from here, not needing to be. The leather gloves remained on the shelf in the main house. Nora had asked him once, carefully, whether he wanted to put them away somewhere. A drawer, a box, somewhere private and enclosed. He had been quiet for long enough that she had thought he might not answer. Then he said that he thought he would leave them where they were, that they belonged to the house the same as the bookshelves and the stone fireplace and the worn places in the floorboards near the kitchen door where years of the same footsteps had left their evidence. She had understood this completely and had not raised the matter again. Some things do not need to be removed. They need only to be accompanied, joined on the shelf by other things, newer things, things that speak of what is being built alongside what was lost. She began leaving her notebook on the shelf in the evenings. Not permanently. She needed it too regularly for that. But in the hours after supper, when the work was done, and the four of them sat in the main room, with the lamp lit against the darkening windows, she would set it there while she read or talked, or simply sat in the particular comfortable silence this house had always seemed to know how to hold. The battered leather cover of the notebook beside the folded leather of the gloves, different textures and different histories resting in the same light on the same shelf. She thought it looked like what it was, a life that had room in it for everything that had come before. A letter arrived from Edmund Farr on an afternoon in the middle of the season. It was short and characteristic, honest and warm and precise in the way he was honest and warm and precise about everything. He wrote that he had met someone in Teller Creek, that she was a widow who ran a small bakery and had opinions about accounting practices that had initially alarmed and subsequently impressed him, that he believed they were well suited. He wished Nora every happiness and hoped the ranch was prospering, and he noted in the final line that the stagecoach company really ought to train their drivers to call out the station names more clearly, as it would save everyone a considerable amount of inconvenience. Nora read it twice, and then she laughed. A real laugh, from somewhere unguarded, the kind that arrives before you have thought about whether to allow it. She brought the letter to Callum in the barn where he was working with the roan she had helped out of the fire, the young horse that was coming along steadily under his patience. He read it, standing there with one hand still resting on the animal's neck. And when he finished, he looked at her with the expression that lived at the edge of the laugh, and said, without any particular inflection, "The Stagecoach Company." "The Stagecoach Company," she agreed, and they stood in the barn in the afternoon light, and something passed between them that was made equally of the humor of it and the depth of it, the improbable, unplanned chain of events that had brought them here, to this barn, to this life, and it was one of those moments that does not announce itself as significant, but settles into memory anyway, the way the best things do, quietly and permanently. She wrote back to Edmund that she was glad for him, that she hoped the baker with opinions would make him very happy, and that she was well, that the ranch was prospering, that she had never in her life been more completely where she belonged. She meant every word. One evening late in the season, they rode up to the ridge. It was the first time since the night the fire had started below them and interrupted what he had been trying to say. They rode in the fading light without hurrying, the horses moving at an easy pace through the dry grass. And when they reached the top, they dismounted and stood in the same place they had stood that night, the place where everything had been on the edge of something, and then had been interrupted and had found its way to resolution through the long, difficult middle of things. The valley below was settling into its evening version of itself. The ranch sat in its hollow with warm light in the windows, the new east wall of the barn clean and straight in the last of the day, the corral a dark circle with the horses moving slowly inside it. The road ran north through the pale grass and disappeared into the distance where the mountains began their slow ascent. The sky above was doing the thing it did every evening out here, building itself into something extraordinary without any apparent effort, the colors deepening from gold to amber to the particular deep rose that preceded the blue. Callum stood with his shoulder against hers, looking out at all of it. "You ever regret it?" he said, quietly. The question he seemed to need to ask, perhaps because the answer mattered too much to assume. Nora looked out at the valley. She thought about the stagecoach and the dust settling in the road and the name on the signpost that was the wrong name. She thought about the trunk that was too heavy and the 3 days that had become a life. She thought about Clover and the accounts and the notebook on the shelf beside the gloves, and Edith pressing a dress without being asked, and Roy's rare and total approving nods, and a man who had put his hands on her shoulders outside a burning barn and looked at her face with something that had nothing careful about it. She thought about the 12-year-old girl who had learned to make herself small enough to survive whatever the world required, and about the woman she had somehow become without entirely noticing. A woman who had walked into a burning barn for 3 horses she barely knew, and who had sat down with a stack of papers and made them yield their secrets, and who had said, "I am afraid and I want to stay," in the same breath, without understanding that those 2 things could coexist until she heard herself say them. She had thought once that a life built on practicality was the only kind she could trust. She understood now that it was not practicality she had been seeking all those years. It was safety. And safety, she had finally learned, was not the absence of risk. It was standing in the right place with the right person and knowing, without needing to prove it, that you were home. No, she said. The word was complete. It contained everything. He took her hand in both of his and held it the way he held things he intended to keep. Below them, the lamp in the kitchen window came on. Edith, beginning the supper work, the small domestic signal that the day was turning toward its close. The mountains darkened around the valley. The first stars appeared above the eastern ridge, one by one, unhurried, the way they always did out here. She leaned her head against his shoulder and let the evening come in around them, unhurried and complete. And the stars continued their slow and indifferent and utterly beautiful work overhead, and the mountains stood as they had always stood, and the two of them remained on the ridge a while longer in no particular hurry, because the place they were going back to was already entirely home.